cloud, okay?
Okay, marvelous.
Now, for anybody that's attending today, you'll notice that we are recording this. So if you don't want your face or whatever to be exposed, obviously make those choices. But we're going to record this for the people that can't make today's presentation or conversation.
Ola się zgrywa, no to o 10%. Zaczynam jeszcze jednocześnie ten web.
Patryku, chyba cię słyszymy.
Okay, sorry.
It's okay, Patrick.
No
that was awesome. You could have been talking about absolutely anything for me, but there are a few people on this line that would understand it, I think.
Okay, guys, so I think we can start. I suppose few people will join us during, let's say, Dave's lecture. So nevertheless, I want to introduce our superstar. It's Dave West. He's CEO of Scrum.org, so he's somehow my boss, actually, and also he's a consultant with many years of experience. So I must admit that I learned a lot from Dave's books. So, for example, I really like the book called The Nexus Framework. So it's amazing. If you want to scale Scrum, you have to read it. So I think that Dave is more competent.
It's a classic.
It's classical. I also have it on my shelf. So I'm only afraid that I'm not able to take any autograph from you. So because we are in different countries right now. Nevertheless, guys, this is a charity meetup. So I encourage you to open your pockets, open your hearts and give some money to Ukrainian kids. So you have links on Meetup, and actually that's all from my side. Dave, stage is yours.
Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, everybody, and for the people that you know, many of the people here are in Poland, I think, and very close to the troubles, to the war in Ukraine. I appreciate being thousands of miles away. It feels very distant, but having 6 Ukrainian trainers who I have many conversations with over the last month, 6 weeks, I really do appreciate what you all are doing in this crisis. It's an awful time that we live in, but it's not what I'm going to be talking about, because it isn't my area of expertise, and maybe this is, or certainly something more akin to it. Thank you for your very kind words. My name's Dave. I'm the CEO at Scrum.org. This is a really small meetup, which is fabulous because it means we'll have the opportunity to interact perhaps a little bit more than we would on a big presentation. If you want to ask a question as we go through today, feel free to just say, Dave. Now, you may notice I talk quite rapidly. I tend to get quite enthusiastic about the things that I'm saying. So that might require some butting in. Don't be shy. It's okay. I won't be offended. We're all friends here together. I'm also got the power to admit people. So occasionally I'll stop and admit people, as I'm not very good at multitasking because I'm a man, and we're not very good at that by biology, it would appear. Also, my wife tells me. So thank you for inviting me. I'm going to talk a little bit about self-management, self-organization, empowerment. There's sort of like this idea that's in Scrum that's sort of like a fundamental to how we build effective teams that are doing Scrum and applying an agile approach to delivering value to their customers and to their stakeholders. I'm going to share some stories along the way, and hopefully we'll get, it probably won't tell you anything you don't already know, but maybe it will tell you in a way that will help you talk about these things with your teams, with your clients, etc. Now, I'm part of a community. I would say I lead it, but I really don't. I think I support it would be perhaps a better word. Where we have 350, almost 360 trainers all around the world, delivering a consistent, repeatable training experience to lots of people. We train somewhere in the region of north of 6,000 people a month Certainly March was about that number. So it's really exciting because I get the opportunity, because of all these trainers in all these different places who invite me to go and visit clients, to talk to people. And now because of virtual world, it's even easier. I get the opportunity to go around talking to people. And because I've got the CEO badge, I can exploit that quite horribly to learn lots of things. And hopefully I can share some of that learning today. We live in very challenging times, right? And I know that your grandparents probably said, well, that's nothing, or your grandparents say, that's nothing. I lived through all this, 2 world wars and the Spanish flu, a mass depression, so I guess there's always times that are challenging. I think the difference is the last 40 years, or certainly the last 50 years, have been relatively stable. And at the moment, we're seeing change at that sort of almost biblical level in the world. Obviously, COVID-19, for me, as the CEO of Scrum.org, 3 years ago, I had a nice product roadmap. I was working against that product roadmap, talking to the community, working out, building some new stuff. Then COVID hit. Roadmap got thrown away. We went to virtual. How do we support our community? What happens, to the trainers that can't teach? What happens to the trainers that are sick? How do we support them? Then Black Lives Matter hit in the US, which had a huge impact on the United States, and a lot of conversation about inclusion. Then we had a little bit of Me Too thrown in, which was always fun. And then we have the war between Russia and Ukraine. We have 6 Russian trainers, 6 Ukrainian trainers. You can imagine it's been a very interesting time here. And frankly, we've been here before, right? Now, I follow an economist called Khalida Perez, and the reason why I'm telling you this is just to set the scene for why self-management, why self-organization, why these empowered teams are so important in this modern age. And so I follow this economist called Khalida Perez, and she's, some people like BTS or Boyzone or, Queen or something. I follow an economist. Now, she talks about technology revolutions, and she believes we're in the 5th revolution. Now, if you may notice, the previous one, when your grandparents were alive, probably 1929 to 1943, lots happened in the world, right? 1890 to 1895, lots happened in the world. Maybe this has happened before. Ultimately, I believe, and she believes, that we're at the stage of we're at this digital age, this age of software and digital that was kicked off in 1971 in California with the microprocessor. And since then, we've been basically going through an adoption model where we have phase 1, phase 2, which is all about early adopters in basically that installation phase. Then there's this sort of like really chaotic, messy bit that we may be in, or we may have been coming out of, that COVID has definitely highlighted. And then it goes into a broad adoption deployment phase where we get this massive expansion. And the reason why I bring that up, or the reason why it's so I'm just admitting a few people, so interesting, is that many of you every day are working in organizations doing agile, right? I get the opportunity to ponce around and talk a little bit about agile and the like. You get the hard reality of having to do it every day. And you have this friction point, right? That against perhaps what you feel, that people are sort of anti-agile, when they ask him for detailed plans, for burn down charts, for PERT charts, for critical path of the work, they talk about resources, not people, all of those things that just frustrate you, get you really mad, right? And the realization that I came to after reading Khalida Perez's book was that actually this is 2 ages rubbing against each other and causing friction. You of the opportunity, because of your experience in Scrum and Agile and that, to bring a very different way of working. Imagine that you were bringing the Henry Ford model of mass production to a mill in northern England in 1780, or actually it'd be a bit later, 1890 something, right? So you're bringing that in to this mill. Now there was these things called Luddites. I don't know if you remember these people. They took their shoes, their clogs, they were wearing clogs, and they threw them in the machines. Now you're like, well, hang on a minute, why is that happening? This is going to produce a lot more stuff. We'll be able to clothe the nation. People will be able to have more than one pair of underwear. You know, it's going to be amazing. But these Luddites, as they were called in Northern England, didn't see the value of it because they thought that it was going to upset their artisan lifestyle. And they were right, actually, as written by people like George Orwell and to some extent, you know, Tolkien. You could argue the whole metaphor of Lord of the Rings was because of this. The world has changed, but you at this sharp end of the friction between these two worlds. So that really manifests itself in this, you know, these different things. And I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about the things that really are about functional, cross-functional teams and decentralized, self-organized working patterns today. But there's some other things that sort of jump out, like short-term planning, the rise of the creator, you know, as opposed to the managers being kings. Creators are ultimately the most important people. So we live in this very much a different world, digital world. Now, Scrum was invented over 25 years ago by Ken and Jeff working together. Jeff was the CTO, Ken was his hired hand, sort of lead the engineering effort, really in response of the challenges of working on software development in the context of this new sort of like paradigm. And that was the reason why Scrum was invented. It was not invented in an academic institution. It wasn't invented by people just thinking, we need a new process. Surprisingly, for many of the people on Twitter, it wasn't invented to make money. In fact, you could argue that Ken systematically tried to not make money a lot, and some of those challenges I still live with today. But anyway, so ultimately it was invented in response to the digital age, this way of working, in the same way as Henry Ford and mass production was invented to take advantage of the technology in the industrial age, the previous age. So agility, really simple. Empiricism, self-management, and a continuous focus on improving both the way you work and the problem that you're trying to solve or the product you're trying to develop. And you do that with a team of people because nobody is an island, and you do it in pursuit of a common outcome, a customer, right? A common outcome, hopefully some problem that you're trying to solve. The most simple agile projects are ones that come in response to a customer need. The team forms, they deliver on that. It's the easiest thing in the world. In fact, some would argue that every time you have a crisis in an organization, this is the most natural way to work in that organization. You create a war room, you empower it, you get the best people, you bring them together, you get executive support. You know, maybe you had a data breach, maybe you've got some major outage, you know, something disastrous has happened, and you get the CEO comes in and helps directly, answers questions and makes decisions, and you just get it done. That's all agility is. Of course, it's not complex, and you know, it's not so easy in these large, successful organizations that have a lot to lose. Remember those artisans in the north of England, those artisans that were very much like, hang on a minute, you're telling me that my job is getting replaced by this big machine, but I do so much more. And that is exactly the reality of most organizations' response to agility. And it's not bad, it's just the reality, right? All of these things sort of get in the way of building these very simple teams aligned to customers and with the right skills. Now, there's a fundamental sort of rule that seems to have crept into organizations in the US in particular, but I think in Europe as well, which is, if you're going to pick one thing, let's not really trust people and because of the risk of trusting them. So how many times have you, ladies and gentlemen, been in a meeting to discuss a $1,000 expense? When you look around the meeting, maybe there's 10 people in it. Maybe their hourly rate, fully loaded, is $150 an hour. Well, hang on a minute, you've spent more on the meeting. No, we haven't now. That's a sunk cost. This is an incremental cost. And we didn't want to deal with the risk of not doing that. But the amount of times we make these decisions because we're so worried about breaking things. Organizations are in, how many times have you signed off a requirement? Remember those things? Why do you sign it off? Does that mean you get sued if the requirement's wrong? Of course not. Of course not. It's because lots of people have signed off the requirement. So if it is wrong, well, you're going to blame 20 people. Those sort of decisions are made all the time to avoid accountability in organizations. Not because we don't want it, or maybe it's because we're risk averse. So at the end of the day, the most important fundamental part of agility is this trust element. I'm going to talk a lot more about this as we go through the slides. And that manifests itself in three things that maybe are the same thing. And I'll talk a little bit about why the Scrum Guide changed to self-managed from self-organizing. Maybe it's these three things are just one, or maybe it's three things. I don't know. I don't really care. But at the end of the day, we empower people to make decisions. We give them an organization that is flexible enough to allow them to work in the way that makes sense for them. And we allow them to take over the tasks that are necessary to deliver the product that we care about or the value that we care about. But what tends to happen in most organizations when they talk about let's just talk about self-management, is that all those issues that we highlighted earlier, team issues, existing process, no support, compliance, impossible deadlines, other projects, HR, whatever, all those things that are pressing down on you, suddenly management uses, they say, well, we're self-managed here, isn't these are your problems to solve. It's just one more thing that ends up hurting you rather than empowering you. It's weaponized, this idea of self-management, rather than actually there to make it a success, which is what we're thinking about. So I just want to stop for a second and tell a story. I want to tell a story about COVID. I want to tell you a story about an organization called the Broad Institute. The Broad Institute are famous for mapping the human genome, blah, 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 and all that sort of stuff. They were a key, in fact, if you walk by their offices in Kendall Square, which is in Cambridge, which is sort of part of Boston, but not, it's this complicated two towns virtually next to each other. Harvard's there, MIT's there. You may have heard of those organizations. And if you walk past their offices in Kendall Square, they've got these really big screens. And what they're showing is the computer decomposition of genomes, so the sequencing. And they've got these labs running and they've just visualized what's happening. It's really cool. And excuse me, and the geek in you would be like, oh yeah, let's just sit out there. If you carry on walking along that street, you can go to the MIT Robot Museum, which is also really cool, but that's a different story. Anyway, I want to tell you about the Broad Institute because it had a really material life impact on me, and Agile was part of that, the reason. So the Broad Institute have been doing Scrum for a long time. Jeff Sutherland went there and trained them. Ken's been there. I mean, they are a sort of poster child. In fact, their offices are very close to Jeff Sutherland's offices at Scrum Inc. And so they're famous for it. They use Scrum. They have Scrum Masters. And they do it because obviously their problems are complex, continuously changing. And they love to build teams. They love to work incrementally and iteratively on the solutions. They love that transparency. They love involving stakeholders. So they've pretty much done a fantastic job in the biotech genetic research world using Scrum, and there's lots of case studies been written. Now, March the 13th, COVID hit Boston 2020. And I remember it very well because I was in the office on March the 13th. We just hired a new person. She'd come into the office and she left early because they were talking about closing airlines and it had all gone a bit crazy. So March the 13th happened. On the Monday after March, that was a Friday, no thing. On the Monday after it, the world ground to a halt in the US. Kids stayed at home. We were all like, do we go outside? Do we not go outside? It was just this crazy moment. Now, the Broad Institute was doing lots of very important genetic testing, you know, stuff that's probably like viruses and all sorts of important stuff. So their scientists had to come in to do the work. But there was no testing facility across the US, was completely flat-footed. And we had very limited testing, and it took a long time. So it was actually irrelevant because by the time you tested, if it was positive, you'd already infected. So you had to assume everybody was positive, which ended up undermining your ability to actually do the job. It was a disaster. So there was a Scrum Master there, just a coincidence. And she said, hey, now I don't know if she said, hey, we can do this, or whether her boss said, hey, could you do this? Or it doesn't really matter. It's been written up in Nature magazine, but I can't actually remember who started it all, but she basically said, we can do this. Yes, we've never worked with live sample testing. Yes, we don't have a secure, safe environment. Yes, we've got lots of reasons why we can't do it, but I think we can do it. So they had a clear goal. And she basically sent an email out, or it was a Slack out, and said, hey, who's going to help me? And a lot of people said, I can help. I can help. Hey, I know the COVID, you know, I've worked with viruses or whatever. So suddenly a team formed around that problem. It's self-organized around, and people dropped in and people dropped out, but generally they had a pretty good team. And then within a week, they'd built a COVID testing facility. The reason why, and it was incredibly efficient. It was, you know, quick turnaround, much faster than the state. Now, they then offered it to the Commonwealth. And what was interesting about it is the Commonwealth couldn't use it. Well, how do we secure, where's the privacy? What about the medical records? What about, how do we pay for it? And they were like, no, we don't want you to pay for it. We'll do the testing. We have additional capacity because we've only got so many scientists. We don't need to be, we want to test them daily, but we have, you know, we can do another 500-600 tests because we have that capability. And they were like, oh, well, we can't use it, thank you. We're going to use the very expensive service that the government is providing for us, and that's incredibly late, and maybe some money is going to the back pockets of some guys that donated to the senators. And anyway, but that's what we're going to do. Sorry, that was a little cynical. Now, they had this additional capacity, and the reason why it was very pertinent to me was my son, Harry, who was at that point 4, was in a preschool that was closed. Now, somebody on the board for that preschool was at the Broad Institute. So they said, hey, let's start testing the kids. If they haven't got it, and the teachers, if they haven't got it, then we can keep running the school. Let's try it. And they tried it, and my son went back to school, which may have saved my marriage. I don't know. It wasn't that bad. But if there was moments, though, I don't know about you. So my point is that she effectively built a team. They self-managed, self-organized in response to a very clearly defined problem. The management gave them very good boundaries. Like there was some things they couldn't do. Like for instance, they took over a part of the building. They had like strips where the samples were coming in, you know, all of that kind of stuff. But they did it really, really quickly and delivered on a problem. So self-organization is a key element to that. And I'm going to talk about 3 things that stand out from that story and many other stories. She had a very clear goal and a feedback loop. When are we going to start testing? Was the measure? How quickly can we do it? How expensive is it? She had a really clear goal. She also had the entire organization of the Broad Institute to help her, because most of them were sitting at home wondering what to do with their kids. She also had, because of the leadership that was in that organization, and this isn't because of the COVID disaster, I think they have that leadership anyway, that she's created an environment that was safe, that allowed people to rapidly try to solve this problem. Now, you could argue that's because they had no alternative. They wanted to continue to do their very important work. They had to have this capability. They could have waited for the government, I suppose, but that wasn't practical. So I'm going to talk about these three things in a little bit more detail. But before I do that, let me just pause for a second and see if there's any questions from the group. Oh, a lot of shouting in the background there. Somebody's at a pub.
Колко година може? Разпитай се Никола. 15 месеца.
Oh, Vladimir. Oh. I'm going to mute you, Vladimir, I'm afraid. But apart from Vladimir, who was obviously in a pub or about to have maybe a cage fight at some sort of wrestling thing, has anybody got any questions or comments before I move into these three things? I guess I'll take that as a no. Don't be shy if you feel a little uncomfortable asking them because maybe you're in a very noisy environment. Obviously, just type them in, and my friend Jacob will stop me and ask them for you. Okay. So, and if you want to do it in Polish, or in any other language, hopefully he can speak it. We're free to do that, and he can then translate it because I speak a little bit of French, but that's about it, and I'm really bad at that.
All right. Okay. I feel like I would like to ask a question right now.
Hello.
If you don't mind. Hello, Łukasz speaking. All right. So I got a question regarding, I would say, big picture related to Scrum. I would like to ask you a question. What's next? Like as you said, 25 years after Manifesto, then we had this refresh 2 years ago. And what's next? What are your predictions regarding software development? Wow. And I know that's a broad.
It's a very big question.
Yes, so, I know. I understand, but let's try to even to touch that. Okay, if you don't mind. Thank you.
I'll talk a little bit about that. I could just quickly address some of that, and then we'll move on with the presentation if that's okay. So there's a couple of things that are obvious. That Scrum has become the sort of like de facto way in which teams are organized. And yes, there's going to be nuances and changes inside the sort of details, the big things for this last release 2.5 or 3 years ago, were the things like the commitments, adding that product goal, the getting rid of the development team, those sort of things. But the essence of Scrum hasn't really changed. The packaging, the way it was, described hasn't. What I see actually isn't Scrum changing that very much. I do think there will be some details and some like nuances that will be emphasized or less important maybe, and the like self-organization versus self-management, why that was changed is a good example of that. And I'll talk about that later. But those little things will continue to be refined. I think it's the context that Scrum lives in is going to be the big thing. I think its relationship, particularly with things like design thinking, lean UX, its relationship with things like flow. We have a class called Professional Scrum with Kanban. We have a PSU class. And the reason why I added those classes to our curriculum was twofold. One, because I wanted to expose our trainers, and many of them had read the books, but until they start training it, thinking about it, talking about it, it's not real for them. I wanted to expose our trainers. And the second thing is, I believe very deeply that one of the biggest problems with Scrum's application today is because we apply it in an industrial mindset, meaning we use it to deliver work, not value. And to some extent, all of the ideas of Scrum work really well if the backlog just describes, work, or if it describes, but they work so much better if it describes value. And obviously lean UX, design thinking, those sort of OKRs, you'll see the work we've done with EBM, which is sort of an OKR, dare I say, implementation. that's focused on agile. Those things, all that thinking is trying to make it more value centric. The other thing that's going to be changing, I think, and we've really avoided, Jacob mentioned the scaling stuff and Nexus. We basically, Nexus was created by the community and then documented by us as describing the patterns that we see when multiple Scrum teams work together on a single product. It is not an organizational change methodology, or a, it's not an equivalent to SAFe or an equivalent to LESS or an equivalent to some of the work that Dad has done and the like. It's not. That's not what it is. It just tells you, you've got multiple teams working together. This is, these are some of your challenges you're going to face. These are some of the patterns that can help you. And it's simple like that. Now, what I see though, however, is that as you scale, you need to both think about two things. You need to think about the flow of value. Like if you've got 500 people, I was going to say 5,000 people, but 500 people working together building a new car, value flows in a way that's really, really interesting. So let's think a little bit about that. So things like Kanban become very, really relevant, and flow, the work that's being done by people like Mick Kersen and the like, very, very interesting. And then thinking about the organizational model, and I'm going to talk briefly about that today, that supports that. The Spotify model has been, talked about a lot, obviously, but some of the underlying ideas of the Spotify model, ignoring the words, are really, really interesting. And how do you scale that? What does it mean for governance? What does it mean for compliance? What does it mean for planning? How do you plan? How do you plan in terms of a portfolio rather than a portfolio of opportunities of investments? How can you change planning to be more investment centric and less work centric? How do you do things like that? I think those things are going to continue, and I'm hoping that Scrum.org can do some of that work and drive some of that thought leadership over the next few years. We've definitely consolidated around Scrum and emphasized that, and then built some bridges to other ideas. Now, I think it's an opportunity as organizations become, as we're in this deployment phase of the digital age, an opportunity really to say, well, hang on a minute. Now is time to really become digital, and what does that mean? So there's some high-level things. Hopefully that answers your question. I think it's going to be interesting. But I do not see the Scrum Guide changing massively over the next couple of years. I do see minor changes, as people email me frequently to remind me that certain things aren't as perfect as they should be. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yes, thank you. And I would say that if it's possible, if you don't mind, and after the call, after this meeting, if you can just prepare a list of good readings related to to future, this would be a great takeaway for, I think, for all the attendees.
Well, I will work with Jacob on that, okay? Because I think that would be a really cool thing. And some of those things I'm going to talk about now. For instance, I do not recommend John Doerr's book. It's a great book, but all the examples aren't OKRs, which is awful. But I do recommend Radical Focus. So I do recommend two of these books, Lean UX and Radical Focus, because one of the most important things, just to take it back onto the subject now again, about self-organization and self-management and empowerment, is this importance of why. The reason why our friends at the Broad Institute were so successful is because of the why. There's an example of a consumer packaged goods company that I can't mention their name, where they were trying to build a new razor, and it was a mess. The program was a mess. They organized around the why. They then utilized that knowledge to drive basically teams to deliver an incredible value, and they released a fabulous razor. It all starts with why. I know that's Simon Sinek's book, which is really just one chapter, but he goes on. But ultimately, the mission sets the stage, and I agree the importance of a clear and defined mission. But the most important thing for a team isn't the mission, it's the product, the customer, the why are they there? Providing what if you believe Dan Pink's work, purpose, this idea of purpose. He talks about 3 things that helps extrinsic motivation: autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Purpose, that why. And then you move on to the how and the what that you do. So it all starts with why. Oh, hang on, sorry. That was, now, once you have the why, then the idea, if you want a team to really be effective around self-management and self-organization, you have to start delivering. Having the ideas is sort of irrelevant until you actually do something. And when we mean deliver, we mean deliver an outcome. Now, that outcome doesn't have to be working software, production level software with a customer. It could be something that because that's a very expensive way sometimes of solving a problem as answering a question. Sometimes it might be to survey. Sometimes it might be a prototype. Sometimes it might be a wireframe. Sometimes it might be, a button on a website to test if people press it. But ultimately, it's delivering and then getting feedback. And describing it. So that means, that's why OKRs and EBM become so important to the why, because you need those key results, the objective and the key results, or EBM, looking at those value metrics to start driving that feedback into the team. Because then that allows them to do something very simple. It allows them to inspect and to adapt. Adapt not only the thing that the problem that they're trying to solve. Should we try this next? Should we try that next? But also how they're working. So self-management and self-organization become super important. It was so important that the Scrum Guide added last release about 3 years ago, as you heard earlier, the why, called the product goal. It's a commitment to the product backlog. So if you want to empower your teams and provide them with an environment, that allows them to self-organize and self-manage, you need to make sure you've got a clear product goal. Now and there needs to be only one. And that product goal can change. Don't get me wrong, it can change, but it provides us with an ability to inspect and adapt the why. It gives us a transparent vehicle when we're in our sprint reviews, when we're in our daily scrums, when we're at sprint planning, to clearly define why we're there and to organize around it. And I think this is really, really important and should be inspired by an OKR or something, that it needs to be measurable. The reason why we wrote it as a goal, or Ken and Jeff wrote it as goal, is because you know when you score. Now, as a Leicester City fan, I'm not sure I always do, because there's many times I think we've scored and we're offside or it doesn't cross the line. But most product goals have a very clear, when you've attained it. The other thing that's really important about a goal that allows self-organization, that provides an environment for success, is the customer. Having that customer provides clarity. How many sprint reviews have you been in when you don't talk about the customer at all? Well, that sounds a bit dodgy, doesn't it? Because ultimately you're trying to deliver that. How many sprint reviews when you read how many sprint planning sessions when you read the backlog, do you have no idea how this PBI, this product backlog item, influences or affects the customer? Many. I see some fabulous Scrum boards on the wall. I don't see many personas on the wall. I don't see many clearly articulated why we're doing it. I was just in a sprint review today, annoyingly, and I said, well, this is great work, great stuff, but who's the customer? Why are we doing this? How does it fit in with my strategic initiative, which has been translated into a product goal for that team? That was very annoying, wasn't it, of me? The other thing that's interesting, though, it's not all about the customer at the end of the day. It is about stakeholders as well. So thinking about that harmony about the why, describing the context that customer is living in the capability of your organization. People have spent money on you to do this for that customer. What's their motivation? It isn't always about the customer. It might be something slightly different. And then I would argue that balance of all these stakeholders is impossible, but harmony can be described and communicated to your team to allow us to effectively to provide that environment where self-management occurs. The other thing that's really, really necessary, I think, and something that, you know, we talked about what the future is, the amount of organizations where teams are not aligned to customers. They have no line of sight to customer. They're a service team. And now sometimes that might make sense because you're providing a service to a group of customers, and those customers could be internal organizations, but you've got to make that explicit. You still have a customer and you've got to have line of sight to that customer. So obviously in Spotify, the tribe is aligned to an element of the values stream for a particular set of customers, and each of squad supports that in their own way. And I think that's super important. The second thing is supporting it. Now, self-managed self-organization requires a level of maturity, right? It requires a level of capability. It requires a level of trust. Now, I know that by telling somebody you're empowered, you're self-managed, all it really means in most traditional organizations is you've got a manager who's given you all their problems. And that isn't what it's about. Ultimately, at the end of the day, if you don't have a support system in place to better enable these teams of self-managed people to work, you're going to have problems. And in many organizations, we encourage the wrong behaviors. This is obviously Machiavelli and The Prince, which is if you've ever had the opportunity to read it, I read it when I was interrailing around Europe because I thought I looked cool. And I think I did. Unfortunately, nobody else did, so that was a little disappointing. But how do we get promoted? It's being indispensable. It's being the go-to person. It's being the font of all knowledge. It's being visible. Hey, it's proving other people wrong. It's, being that guy. How do I get my bonused? It's what my boss wants me to do. I'll do anything my boss wants me to do. How do I get liked? Well, it's best not to get, all of these things influence our behaviors. And actually, most organizations encourage it. There's a large financial services company based in Boston, one of the biggest private financial services companies in the world. They were the third company to do Scrum. Ken went in fact, he paid for his daughter's Harvard education with the consulting opportunity that provided. He always says, I couldn't get them to use Scrum effectively, but I could get my daughter through Harvard. So it was a success. And what was interesting about that is actually that program was a massive success, but the second program wasn't. And the third one was even worse. And in fact, they just, they were saying they were doing Scrum, but they weren't. Recently, they've actually adopted Scrum again in a way that is totally cool. And it's actually starting to deliver value across the whole organization. And one of the things they've changed this time is incentives, promotions, and support, which I think is really, really interesting. That they've fundamentally really understood this team of creators with purpose. The opt-in model, which is, if you go to Tesla, is an extreme. Literally, they grab everybody, put them in a room, say, hey, these are the problems we're serving on. What do you want to work on? And you go and pick the thing you want. They want to work together. They self-organize around that work, and they have a clear direction guided by business goals. The other thing that's really important, that what we're seeing these organizations start to really invest in, historically, the information around the customer was clearly only in one place. The business analyst, the project manager, the person that this subject matter expert. Now we're accepting that everybody needs to waste their time a little bit getting to know what the customer wants, because they'll bring a different perspective. And then you add specialist skills to that broad understanding, which really helps to create an environment where you have the skills to do self-management. So obviously, if you're doing Spotify, that's when you have these ideas of chapters and guilds, you know, where promotion and development and mastery is being supported. You've got a shoulder to cry on. Actually, when I worked for the government in the UK, I had somebody allocated that was in a similar position to me in a different team to mentor and coach me. That was a really successful model until he got a better job and left, and then I followed him, which might actually be a very good example of how it can be very successful. I don't know. A question that you should ask yourself every day, and I try to do this because my God rest her soul, she was one of the best people ever, my grandmother, she'd say, not what have you done today, but who have you helped? Imagine if you actually make some time every day to help somebody else, help them get better at their craft, help them understand how they can operate in the environment, share some of your wisdom, or just be somebody that can listen. Really, really important, particularly in these very troubled times. The last thing, and I am conscious of time, sorry, is around this environment of safety. The thing that's really interesting about self-organization and self-management is that it doesn't just extend to the team. You're self-managed, everybody else isn't. You have to also create an environment for your stakeholders, for the Scrum Master, the product owner, for everybody that's the managers, where there's mutual respect, shared values, goals, commitments, and working agreements. Those things become super important because even if the team is very, very functional and has all those things in place, if the environment around it doesn't, it will break. Now, we did a survey with McKinsey a while ago. It was a minimal viable survey. It was only 60 people, but very detailed analysis. And what we found was actually the most effective characteristic. This is a personality survey. Agreeableness. Agreeableness. This yes and, not yes but, this creating an environment where people aren't confrontational. I was on a call today actually where it got a little confrontational, and I was like, well, this isn't going to get anybody any good, is it? But you could see people shrinking back, people not wanting to get involved. That's not great. So Google also found this on Project Aristotle, Archimedes. I guess it was ours. Anyway, they had a big project to determine why some teams at Google were more effective than other teams. Oh, somebody's trying to come in that I've missed. Hope she wasn't sitting there for hours. I apologize, Pat. You may have been sitting there for hours. I was presenting. I sort of forgot, but there's going to be a great recording. Anyway, what the Project Aristotle, Archimedes, I think it was Aristotle, found was actually, it wasn't the people that went to Stanford, that went to Harvard, that went to the best universities, wasn't the smartest people, wasn't the rich, the people that were paid the most. It was actually psychological safety was one of the key characteristics that actually provided an environment for success. Now, to create psychological safety, you have to still have management. Now, this is very annoying for me personally, because I became a CEO and instantly they said, yeah. So I was expected to be carried around by people on one of those litters you get in ancient Rome. Unfortunately, though, they said, no, you're the bottom of the organization now. I'm like, brilliant. So my entire job is to say to people, how can I help you to be successful? Which is really annoying when I want to say to them. So I provide direction and ask that question. I do it in the context of a value system that we have extended at scrum.org. These are the Scrum values: respect, commitment, courage, focus, and openness. We also have something called kindness, which is really important at scrum.org. Kindness is, when somebody comes to us with, hey, look, I love safe, instead of being rude about safe, even though many of us want to be, maybe, we say, well, that's really interesting. We don't know that, but we know this. Have you seen this? We always approach people at the place that they are at. We always try to be respectful. We have a platinum rule, which is not treat others as you want to be treated, but treat others how they want to be treated. And because of that, hopefully our environment is more open and inclusive and maybe safe. So, and I whizzed through those towards the end, and I apologize. I hadn't actually delivered this deck before, so apologies if it's not as good as it should be. But what I really wanted to emphasize today is team self-management. Self-management is really difficult. It's difficult because the industrial paradigm was anti this. It was about telling people what to do. It was about managing risks. It was about creating competition. It wasn't an infinite game. It was a finite game. That was the whole purpose. We've moved to a different model. You need to think about purpose. You need to think about support, and you need to think about safety, both physically and psychologically. And I emphasize physical safety. Now, obviously, in the Ukraine, we're very aware of it. But actually, I was talking to an African-American member of a team, and we were talking about, you know, how do we get psychological safety in your team? And he goes, I actually wouldn't mind safety. I was like, what do you mean? Whenever he gets in his car and drives home, he's always worried about being pulled over by the police. He drives a very nice car. He's a very successful knowledge worker. And it was just interesting that by him sharing that, it changed my entire view that it's not just about sometimes psychological safety. It's about a broader idea of safety, because he was always a little bit, he wasn't as involved. He was separate, because ultimately the white people on that team didn't have that same problem, which is really, really interesting. Now, I would argue that the first step to being successful in this, around this personal development, around self-organization, self-management, etc., is to find somebody that's done it before to help you. And the last story I'm going to tell you is Scrum.org, a story about Scrum.org. So recently we hired a Scrum Master. I know. Now those accountabilities have been traditionally done by different members of our team, because all of us know Scrum really, really well, right? We teach you, if you join Scrum.org, you go through our training, you spend time with our PSTs. We have PSTs on staff. We'd use PSTs to do the role. And I felt that we weren't delivering the two most important traits that are measures that we're focused on, which is really this frequent delivery of value to our customers, to our partners, and to our channel, and happiness of the team and the morale that everybody wants to come to work. And I was worried that we weren't doing that as well as we had done before the pandemic in particular. And I thought about getting a PST to come and help me do that, one of our trainers. And the reason why I didn't do it is primarily because they're all inside the system. So getting an external person to your system is what we did, or an external person to our system is what we did. And we brought in a Scrum Master, and he's only been here like a month now, 6 weeks, yeah, about a month. And it's just interesting how things are changing. And they're all things I would have probably suggested, but I just didn't think, because I was inside the system. And psychological safety and self-organization and clear goals and mission, all this stuff, we do really well, I thought, but we hadn't stepped back and looked at it from an outside perspective. So it was incredibly valuable bringing in this external person to help us think about that. And that's Scrum.org. And we kind of know Scrum. So anyway, that's what I wanted to talk about today. Hopefully this has been interesting. Jacob, you told me to do this. You said, Dave, talk about self-management. I was like, okay, because obviously I'm at the bottom of the, and he's at the top because he's dealing with customers. So I do what he says. But thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. I think we've got a minute for a little question. Is there any questions or comments or?
Guys, would you like to ask something?
It doesn't have to just be about what we've talked about. It can be anything, apart from how do I pass PSM3, which obviously that's secret. Hard work, lots of thinking. Have you got any questions, Jacob? I mean, let's not discount you. Oh,
there is
if I may ask
hi.
a question.
Yeah, hi.
Yes.
Hi, Łukasz here. If like being, you know, a Scrum Master or a manager in an organization, and you think that the team lacks this like self-organizational traits, like you described in this example of like building, this testing facility. It's like a great example of like people seeing the problem and jumping and like gathering a group of people and doing this, and you don't observe such behaviors in your team, and they think, okay, we're lacking something. So like, what would you like check first? So the safety,
No,
I don't know.
I tend to concentrate on three things, I suppose. But the one thing I'd start with first is working out why we're here and making sure everybody knows that. So I was in Brazil about 4 years ago, and because Brazil's a pain to get to from Boston, I was in Sao Paulo. I wanted to spend a week. So the trainers there all took me to different of their clients. And the first day, I was like jet lagged and talking to all these people, and it was fun. It was great. And then I thought, you know, there's something missing. So I started asking some questions. Obviously, you know, I can't speak Portuguese, so it was a little, I'd ask different members of the teams that I was asked why their team was there. And it was really striking how different the perspectives were, what their goals were, what they believed their goals were. So I think number one is that value, you know, why are you here, that purpose concept. The second one is really around psychological safety. How do you start mirroring the behavior? And I'll give you an example. So this large consumer packaged goods organization was very successful using Scrum, built a new razor, awesome razor. Being a bald man, I appreciate razors. Now, otherwise I just have a silly like hair coming anyway. So they then started rolling out Scrum across the whole organization, all their R&D functions. And there was a program that was running, and they brought Scrum in, and the first sprint review was a disaster. You know, the customer was like, is that really what we're doing? Is that what, you know, the stakeholders were all there, the senior people, it was a disaster. Now, I consider that to be a really positive thing. But the band 6, the manager was like, no. So afterwards, he said, that's never happening again. You guys, you can't deal with these stakeholders. I'm going to run the sprint reviews. You like don't. And he totally destroyed psychological safety in that team. So they carried on doing Scrum, but they really weren't. And the project just sort of petered out. So having a clear idea of purpose, and looking at what the safety, you know, and you can't really measure safety. So what I tend to do is I tend to start exhibiting some of the behaviors. Like I tend to be encouraging failure. That sounds awful. Encouraging transparency. I tend to be asking questions rather than telling, you know, those sort of behaviors become interesting. I try to get, let's go after a sprint review or a daily, I'll go up to somebody that hasn't said anything and said, hey, no, you didn't say anything. What's your take on it all then? And starting to build this environment where people feel that they're part of something. As a leader, that's my job. My job is when I go to a face-to-face and I see Jacob or any of the team, and maybe Jacob's sitting there on his own and he's not participating. My job is to find out why. But I don't do that by going, why aren't you participating? I have a conversation with him. I sit down. I maybe have a cup of coffee or a cup of tea if you're English, or Turkish. Very different tea though. So I think those two things, you know, are very, very important. And then you start building a support organization. Hey, you should really help Bob. You should help Jim. You should help Fred, and start building that slowly. But the goal, number one, purpose, because if you can't clearly describe that, everything else is just going to be a disaster.
Well, thanks.
Cool. And Pat, I noticed that Pat's on video. You were waiting in the waiting room for like 2 hours, weren't you? You were like, there was a big like cord and the two bouncers were standing in front of you. I do apologize. I was in mid-flow and I completely didn't see you pop up on my screen. I'm so sorry.
I was on the mobile phone, but the battery was low, so I had to change the device.
Ah, okay. So, well, if you, I still feel bad, and you can allow me to feel bad just for a moment, but very nice to see your face. I'm glad that you managed to get back, even if it did take a while for me.
No problem. I have also a question for you, because in the pandemic time right now, there's a lot of meetings. I think all of us have a lot of meetings, more than in early days before COVID. Do you have a secret weapon for those meetings? How to deal with them? Because there's no much time to work for conceptual work.
Pat, yeah, preaching to, when I was working at IBM, so I was working for a company called Rational Software. I was the RUP product manager, and we were bought by IBM. And I went from a reasonable life of like, you know, a few meetings, but literally managing my own life, to being in meetings for 9 hours a day. I literally was overlapping meetings. I'd get invited to every bloody thing ever, because RUP, as you can imagine, was in every part of our product, you know? So everybody wanted to involve the product manager of RUP. I was like, Jesus. So I appreciate your pain. What I tend to do, and it's interesting what our Scrum Master is doing at the moment in scrum.org, we also suffer for a little bit of meetingness, is I tend to really focus on the purpose. So what he's doing, which is interesting, is he's basically said all meetings, unless really, really important, should only be 30 minutes, which I think is interesting. He does 25 minutes for some reason. I don't totally get that, but 30 minutes. I think he's got a setting that it automatically defaults to 25. He says always, it needs to be short, needs to start with the purpose. Somebody needs to take actions. You should have a clearly described facilitator. And what you find is, and what we're finding, is that the meetings that have a very clear purpose, or you should be part of, that clearly it becomes a lot tighter. And you end up, the other meetings obviously still happen sometimes, but they sort of fizzle out because it's clear that you haven't got a purpose. The other thing that he's doing is he's like encouraging us to, using Slack and some other technology, have collaboration before, you know, so prep time and actually building prep time for meetings, which allows us to do work so the meetings are much more effective. He's been a little bit aggressive actually on the meeting thing, because sometimes I actually like meetings just to see human beings, because you know, I mean, I'm going back to the office now, but when I'm in the office, I'm on my own. So it's great. So he's being a little bit aggressive. So we don't, like, for instance, I missed a whole thing about March Madness because we don't do as much small talk as we used to do. But he's definitely reduced the number of meetings. They're probably things you're already thinking of doing, Pat. Yeah, the other thing is, if you don't need to be there, don't go, and see if anybody notices. That's the other thing. That's the other thing that I've always amused about. So at IBM, that's exactly what I did. I was invited to all these meetings, and then I was sick, and I missed a bunch, and nobody noticed. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. So then I started actively avoiding and then just pinging the leaders of these meetings and saying, hey, I couldn't make it. I had a clash. Didn't ever say what it was about. Which clash I was doing actual work. Is there anything I need to know? And so, yeah, is there anything that I should be dealing with? Is there anything, you know? And people were like, oh, yeah. But the other thing that I found at IBM was that you go to a meeting, but people were there, but they weren't really. They were all doing email. They were all doing work. Because they couldn't not. The other thing that we've instigated is we have meeting-free Fridays, and we only have meetings. We have these core hours, which has gone a bit messy, but we used to have these core hours. That hasn't kind of worked, but we certainly have meeting-free Fridays, which which probably could be a Monday, because I'm always so knackered by Friday that I'd rather not start work on something, but that's another story. Hopefully that answers your question, Pat.
Yeah, very useful. Thank you.
Okay, and I know we've come up to the time. We're a little bit over. So thank you, everybody. And just to remind you, remember to give. There's a lot of horrible things happening in the world, and money won't solve those things, but it will help. So
yeah, always.
so you'll see that on the webpage associated with it. I'll work with Jacob on a little list of, hey, if you're bored or if you've trouble sleeping, these are some things you should read. Okay.
Okay,
Brilliant.
so Dave, I'm really happy that you are with us. I learn a lot from you, so I hope we will see soon in any kind of situation. So thank you very much for your time.
You're very welcome, and thank you, and all the people living in Poland and Eastern Europe today. Thank you for being so amazing, and I feel such a long way away. So I appreciate all your hard work, and hopefully you're doing the same with Scrum and changing the world while I just talk about it.
Thank you, Dave. Love the session.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Cheers.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
I'm going to give you the host back.
Okay, can you just turn off recording before?
Oh, I should do that, shouldn't I?
So I'm not sure